Today is August 8th, 2022. My name is Randy Flaherty. I serve as head of special collections at the UVA Law Library, and I am joining via Zoom from Charlottesville, Virginia, where we are doing an oral history on UVA Law's clinic on state and local government policy, specifically as it relates to its work on the Virginia Commission to examine racial and economic inequality in Virginia law. So I'll just kick it to you, Scott, if you could introduce yourself first, just your name and where you are today.
Sure. My name is Scott Chamberlain, class of 2023 at UVA Law, and I'm calling in from Washington, D.C.
And I'm Andy Block, and I teach at the law school, and I direct the state and local government policy clinic and was a member of the commission that we'll be talking about today.
So Scott, I was wondering, when were you part of this clinic at UVA Law?
So I joined the clinic last fall, so fall of 2021, but I also worked as an RA for the second half of the summer for Andy as a research assistant prior to that. So I started working with the commission, I guess that was like June of 2021.
And what drew you to this work?
I knew coming into law school, I wanted to work in policy in some form, but wasn't quite sure what that would look like. So I was really excited when I found out about this clinic and specifically about the work the commission was doing. I think like a lot of people in the wake of 2020 and the George Floyd protests, really wanted to find a way to get involved, particularly at the local level in racial equity work. So the work the clinic was doing specifically with the commission really appealed to me.
I'm curious if the clinic's work is sort of distinct within the law school.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know, Andy, I guess we've never really talked about this, like exactly what your motivation was in forming it, but I think there's been a change in the last few decades of students who come into law school, maybe not interested in like the traditional litigation or firm work route. And I think this clinic represents a really unique opportunity for students who are interested in that kind of policy work.
Yeah, and that you're correct in your intuition, Scott, that one of my motivations for starting the clinic was to give students who wanted to do policy work an opportunity to be exposed to it and hopefully develop a little bit of skill and understanding of it, and also had to have something to put on their resume when seeking policy work or seeking government work.
Scott, when you joined the clinic, I mean, how big is the clinic? I don't have a sense of that myself.
It's pretty small. There were what, 10 of us, 12 of us? I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, pretty small. And
so when you joined in the fall, did you have a sense already of what this project was going to be that you were going to work on?
So the work with the commission, I had a sense of what that looked like since I'd done it over the summer. The bulk of my work for the clinic was revitalizing a program called the Delinquency Prevention and Youth Development Act. I used to say that like every day. I haven't said it in a few months. And so we worked with a state senator on updating the act. It was still on the books, but it hadn't been touched in a long time and it hadn't been included in the governor's budget in a long time since the Great Recession. So we worked on updating that. And no, I honestly hadn't done much of this kind of policy work before or like legislative drafting. And we actually got to draft the text of the bill. We met with state agencies to get their feedback on it. We did a lot of iterative rounds of meeting with our senator and meeting with state agencies and then doing internal redrafts of it before it actually went through the Senate and the House. So no, I wasn't familiar with that kind of work, and that was really exciting. The work with the commission, I did have some exposure to since I'd worked on it over the summer.
So what was your work for the summer before you joined the clinic?
Yeah, so I worked with Joe Eldridge. I'm not sure if you've talked with him yet or planning to talk with him, but I came in midway through the summer. So he and another student and Andy had already been working on some things, and I worked primarily on a few different issues within the rural section of the report, focusing on disparities in rural Virginia. So I worked on healthcare, tax assessments, and infrastructure within that. And then Joe and I presented some of our findings and our proposals to the commission to then recommend to the state legislature.
So what was your work process like?
There's a lot of research. So gosh, what did we do as the Andy, can you jog my memory? Where did we where did we look to when we were doing the initial research on issues in
So
Virginia?
I think for your rural work, Scott, you kind of jumped in and built on what Joe had already started.
That's
He
right.
had done
That's
a
right.
lot of it. And then you and I, and then a student who started in the fall, also looked at an issue that the commission was interested in, which was kind of racial disparities in local property tax assessments.
Yes.
And so you helped spearhead that work. I mean, that had started, I think, a little bit before you came in the summer as well. But that involved talking to historians and talking to experts who had done this national study on property tax assessments, and ultimately talking to local folks, tax assessors, and so all different pieces of it. And then like a big piece of work that Scott did ultimately was to help write the report that this commission issued, which involved synthesizing everything that had been presented both during the summer when Scott was participating and before that as well.
Thank you. That was helpful. Yeah, that's right. We did a lot of working with like local agencies who were implementing some of the things we were discussing. So like specifically with the property tax assessments, I remember one of the big challenges was there's like what's written in the state statutes, and then there's the agency regulations, and then there's what localities actually implement. So you could get some information from like looking online or reading the statutes, but a lot of it was actually talking to people at the local level and saying like, okay, this is what the state has mandated, or it's not clear to us what they've mandated. What does it look like when you actually implement these practices? And then similarly, we followed a similar process with some population health stuff that we were researching. So talking to folks in the Virginia Department of Health about what the regulations actually looked like when they implemented them on the ground.
So I'm always curious in this time of COVID, when you say you're talking to people, how is this actually playing out?
Yeah, it was mostly just cold emailing people and saying, hey, we're working on this thing, for the governor's commission. Would you be willing to chat with us? And 99% of the time, people were really eager to, which was exciting because they're experts in this, and something that we'd been puzzling over for hours, they could explain in 15 minutes. And I think a lot of people were excited that there were other people who were willing to learn about this and were really excited to hear about it and would actually turn it into some kind of tangible proposal.
And are you doing a lot of this work? It sounds like you're working with your clinic or your law school colleagues, or is this on your own?
It was typically with a partner. So over the summer, I worked most closely with Joe Aldridge, and then during the school year, Maggie Woodward and I, as Andy mentioned, compiled the work that the commission had done over the previous year and put it in like a sequential format within a report, and added, introductions and some explanatory material and graphics and things like that. So it wasn't just a jumble of disconnected proposals.
Yeah, those images are quite striking. They really add a lot. I guess I want to back up for a second, because there were two commissions. I mean, officially, right? But really, is there any sort of, in practice, is there any break between the two, or are the two commissions sort of, as it's reformed, basically the same thing? Maybe that's more of a question for Andy.
So part of the genesis of the second commission was a legal necessity, which is that executive orders can only have effect for a certain amount of time. And so the governor had to issue a new executive order. And then, so the Commission on Racial Inequity in Virginia Law, one of the priority issues we had identified that we wanted to work on as the prior executive order was expiring was the issue of economic opportunity. And so when the governor issued the new executive order, he retitled the commission to emphasize that focus, but then also added new members. I think a couple stepped off, and he added some others that had more expertise in that content area. So the first commission was all lawyers and judges and law professors. We had some non-lawyers in the second commission who had more expertise in business and economics and the interplay with those things and race. So it was great. We kind of got some new blood and a narrower focus. It wasn't that narrow, but it was at least a little bit narrower than what had happened before.
And as I understand it, the rural issues was sort of a new topic for this final report. Can you talk a little bit about how that became so core to this final element of the commission?
Sure. And Scott, I'll take this because I don't think you were around when this happened. So when the Commission on Racial Inequity in Virginia Law issued its first report, we got some public comment that a lot of the disparities we looked at were probably based on research that had been done in urban areas and not rural areas, and that racial disparities existed in rural communities, but they had kind of a unique set of challenges associated with them, and policy responses probably had to be more unique and tailored as well. And so we thought that was a good point at the commission, and we decided that we would, take a look at that as well. And I'm glad that we did, because, as the report suggests, as the research suggests, there's a lot to it, and it's complex.
Scott, I was wondering how much you interacted with the commission in your work, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I got to present to them with Joe about our proposals, and it was exciting. It was exciting being in a room with people who, as Annie mentioned, are experts or have been engaged with the community for decades, and really knew what kind of impact some of these proposals would have in a way that we couldn't. So getting to meet with them in person and talk through what we thought were good ideas and what we thought the impact would be, and then hearing like immediate direct feedback from them about what they thought would work well and what wouldn't, was really exciting, because I think that's the kind of feedback and insight it's impossible to get without the lived experience the people in the room had.
And how did they receive your recommendations?
Mostly very positively. I don't remember like the exact numbers, but the overwhelming majority were recommended to the legislature either as we had written them or with minor modifications. And occasionally they would pull one out and say this won't work for XYZ reasons, or we need to tweak it pretty significantly, and we'll have to get feedback from other stakeholders first. But yeah, for the most part, people I think were excited about our proposals. And again, it felt good to have a hand in creating tangible next steps that the state could potentially utilize.
Were you nervous?
Oh yeah, definitely. But I mean, Andy did a great job helping us prep, and we did a lot of dry runs and, reviewing our decks and meeting beforehand with each other. So I felt as prepared as I could have. Certainly still nervous, but mostly excited.
So did you go to Richmond for this, or were you going all over?
Yeah, we went to Richmond for the proposal, and that's where they had a large conference room where the commission would meet, and Joe and I did our presentation. They had members or representatives from other like advocacy groups or agencies come in as well. So Joe and I were part of like the scheduled presentations. But yeah, we did that in Richmond at the Capitol. Yeah,
so I've seen lots of mentions of public feedback and talking to sort of stakeholder groups. How did that play out?
The public feedback I wasn't super involved with. I don't remember if we got public comments on our specific portion of the presentation. Meeting with the stakeholder groups, like I said, was mostly exciting, because I think people had developed expertise for a long time, and they were usually very eager to share what they knew were issues and what they knew could be implemented to fix those issues.
And just to kind of build on what Scott said, I think it seemed like with some of the conversations we had, both ones that Scott participated in and others, particularly when we're looking at the rural issues, it seemed like people had been just sitting there waiting for someone to come along and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or tell us more about this problem. And kind of an exciting part of policy work, especially this policy work, is to kind of lift up the voices of folks who've been, toiling for a long time, but haven't been heard or haven't had their voices raised up to kind of the level where the governor is paying attention to what they have to say. And so I think we provided that opportunity and forum, and whether it was in the report, quoting people or referring people, or in a presentation, or identifying folks who should come testify before the commission. I think that was a big part of what we were trying to do, was to kind of facilitate that. And I think when we were talking to Juliet and Catherine, they were saying that too, right? It wasn't that we were taking full credit for all these ideas. Like, a lot of these ideas were ideas that people had for a while. They just hadn't been amplified, or highlighted in the right way. So it was nice to be part of that amplification process.
Was there a memorable moment for you in these presentations that you made?
I don't remember a particular standout moment. I think there were some proposals that felt like really easy wins, and that was exciting. Like, I think talking about, like, with the property tax assessments, one of our proposals was mandating a right to notice of appeal, that homeowners can appeal their assessment. And I think for everyone in the room, it was like, oh yeah, this is super low hanging fruit. Of course we should do this. Why hasn't this happened before? So there were a couple like that where it felt good to be able to lay out like a simple, identifiable improvement and have people immediately understand what it was and why it would work.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe, I guess, talking a little bit more about the topics that you really were spearheading in your research. Can you tell me a little bit about those and sort of what you learned from your research?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, most of my involvement over the summer was with rural issues. I think some of the most shocking information that we researched was about the health disparities between Black and white Virginians in rural areas. Like, I don't remember the exact number, but the maternal mortality rate between Black mothers and white mothers was really shocking. And there's a lot that could be done immediately to help address that. I'm sorry, I forgot exactly what your question was. Can you repeat it, please?
Just what did you learn from your research?
Yeah, so I'd say I think it was very eye-opening in that I realized how vast some of these gulfs still are, right, in our own communities, in our own backyards, and how not easy it would be to fix them, but how there are solutions available to us if we have the political will to act on them. And again, I think there are really stark divides that would shock a lot of people, and that surprised me while I was doing the research.
One of the things, maybe Scott, you could talk about a little bit that is related to what Randy just asked is as I recall, you drafted the introduction to the this report, and we were putting out the report after the 2021 gubernatorial election. So it was after Governor Youngkin was elected. So we knew Governor Northam was leaving, and a big issue in the campaign had been this issue of critical race theory. And so we wanted to say something about it, but it was a complicated political moment to say something about it. And so Scott was tasked with trying to thread that needle. So maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of how you thought about that and that process, because that was an important piece of work.
Yeah, that was tough. I think that was the hardest part of the whole project for me. And I'm proud to say most of what I wrote ended up in the final version of the introduction. So at least some other people thought it was decent. But yeah, that was really difficult.
Including me, by the way.
It was something Andy and I talked a lot about individually, and also something we talked about more broadly in the clinic this year was how you communicate these kind of ideas to like a broad a portion of the population as possible without turning people off. And I think it's really difficult to both state what the issues are and do it in a way that people don't find as inflammatory, without softening what the actual problems are. And like Andy mentioned, this was in the wake of like the anti-CRT backlash. So we knew that it was possible people would read this with that kind of mindset. In particular, the incoming administration had expressed dissatisfaction with some of the way race was being discussed in Virginia and within the government. So ultimately, the way we did it was to try to make it as fact-based and as objective as possible. So say, here are the disparities that exist in Virginia, like the undisputable differences. We are all Virginians. We're all committed to these kind of ideals of equality and democracy. So like those two things are factual. We're all on the same page about those. And then the third step is kind of, now what do we do with that information? And that's what this report is like, we're all in the same spot on those first two. Now the third step is, how do we address those issues? And that probably is where you lose people inevitably, I think, but we tried our best to draw people in with those kind of common factors that we all share before discussing what proposals might look like. And that was, we met with a lot of state Congress people. They would visit our class, and we met with PR experts. And so sometimes when they came, we would ask them questions specifically about these topics. And so their insights there were helpful too in thinking about how to frame this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm so glad you talked about that. I was thinking of that context as I'm reading this introduction and the conclusion. So having you explain that is really useful. I'm interested in the sense of responsibility you felt and what that was like, but I also want to backtrack a little bit. And you've talked about this research process and then the process of making recommendations. Can you talk a little bit more about how that plays out in the course of clinic work? How do you move from research to recommendation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with everything we did, our recommendations were informed by the people we talked to first and foremost. Like Andy said, there's some stuff where we would read it and we'd go, it seems like there's probably like a proposal here, and we can all kind of see the shape of it. But it was almost always when we talked to experts that and again, like Andy mentioned, oftentimes they'd been thinking about these solutions for years, and they had very clear, specific proposals in mind. So we would go and we'd say, hey, here's what our research found, and this seems a little strange, or it seems like maybe this might not be that effective. Can you tell us about it? And then they would have generally very specific proposals. Sometimes we would come with one in mind, and then oftentimes we would change with a very different, or we would leave the conversation with a very different format than what we've been thinking initially, or they would explain, implications that we couldn't have foreseen, but they would say, no, if you do that, this will affect other things in this way, so you should frame it this way instead. So yeah, it was usually we would come with a bunch of information that we'd gather, than just say, hey, here's what we see. Does this match what you see?
Mm-hmm. When did the clinic meet all together?
We met every week. We had like a small group meeting, our supervision every week. And then we also met as a class with all 10 of us. Was that every week or every other week?
In the fall is every week.
Thank
In the
you.
spring it was every other week.
So we met with at least a handful of members every week, and then most of the time with all 10 of us every week. By the second half of the year, every other week.
And so you would sort of share your recommendations with the group, or what were the sort of the goals of those large group meetings?
Yeah, so the first half of the year we did like more traditional classroom style education stuff. Like we would do readings on like the state constitution, or we would read something. We had like a handbook for, what was that called? Like the policy. Yes, thank you. The policy writing handbook. We would read sections of that and discuss it, and we would have every weekend you would have a guest visit us who were experts in either specific types of policy or law, and they would often connect to what we had read. We would discuss that with them. In the second half of the year, because we were all a lot more involved in our projects by that point, that turned into more like case rounds where we would talk about the people we were meeting with or the obstacles that we encountered while we were working on projects, and kind of share ideas and hear about the status of other folks' projects.
What were some of the things you would have debated or not necessarily agreed with everyone on in the clinic?
There wasn't often like, we didn't really get into like the substantive portions of other people's work. I guess sometimes when we had speakers, I think you could sense that different folks in the class had different approaches based on the questions we would ask. But I don't know that we ever, Andy, did we ever like debate like different styles or different approaches of policy work? Not that I can recall.
I don't think so. I think we had some discussion, say, about how to deal with the critical race theory question. We definitely workshopped that a bit, and both internally and externally. And obviously Scott and I are two white guys, and so who are we to say what should be said on those issues? And so it was important that we get input from others and thinking about that. And I think when it came time to present in the General Assembly and testify, maybe there was more kind of workshopping, because there you have a very limited amount of time. And so you really have to make it count as much as possible in terms of your testimony. So there's a lot of stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor. And so figuring out what stays, what goes, that kind of thing. I think there were probably more discussions around that, like what were really the key points and what's really the best way to say something in 2 minutes. It's not like oral argument in front of a judge where you have half an hour or 25 minutes or whatever it is. It's like a short cup of espresso every time. That's about all you got.
I think that's where other folks' feedback is very helpful too, because you've gotten so immersed in whatever topic you're working on. It's hard to tell like what is intuitive to an audience that's not familiar with it versus what is easy to grasp. So having other people say, I didn't understand that part of it, or you spent too much time on this, and we got that as soon as you said it. I think that was helpful.
Did you do full training runs? I'm fascinated by like in the weeds mechanics here. Did you do the full training run of your presentations?
We definitely did with our small group, like our supervision group, which was me and my partner, and then another set of partners. I don't know that we ever did, like we sat and did the full presentation with the full clinic. We definitely at least talked about like the skeletons of our presentations, but I don't know if we ever did a full run with them. But yeah, with our small group, we did.
What was it like to have this responsibility of making these recommendations on a very large stage?
It was intimidating, but also again exciting. Like I said, I came to law school knowing I wanted to do policy work, and this was really the first opportunity I've had to get hands-on experience working on it. And with the commission work, we knew that a lot of the proposals wouldn't necessarily end up getting worked on because we had a lot of them, and legislators' time is limited. But it was still very exciting knowing that, like Andy said, this is something the governor was paying attention to, and his team had made a priority. So knowing that felt exciting before pitching these kind of things. And then with the legislation we worked on in the clinic, because that was one specific piece of legislation that we knew we had a sponsor for, and we knew we would testify on behalf of, that one we wanted to make sure we had like airtight before we went there, and that was really exciting.
So you were part of testifying for that one?
Mm-hmm. I testified in the Senate, and my partner testified in the House. So I testified in the Senate subcommittee that was reviewing it, and that it ended up, because the elections went the way they did, we had to make some changes on the fly, and we weren't sure exactly how it was going to go when we testified. And for a minute during the testimony, it looked rocky, but Andy actually was there in person and ended up allaying some of the concerns folks in the room had with the bill, and ended up getting passed. But yeah, it ended up being a little more exciting than we thought it would be when we had planned for it initially.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it and how it went down?
Yeah, I mean, folks had a lot of questions about the bill, ones that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. We did a lot of work beforehand trying to anticipate what the questions would be and what the concerns people had were. And some of the questions that came up, I don't think would have been possible to anticipate because they weren't necessarily based on like the text of the bill or anything we were actually discussing. I don't remember. I think it was the chairman, one of the people in the room. I don't remember what his specific question was or what his concern was, but it was something the bill directly addressed. And he basically said, you need to take this back and work on it to make sure it incorporates it. And that was when Andy stepped up to the mic and said, this is actually already part of the bill. And I think that smoothed things over. But yeah, it was a lot of just kind of prodding at it in unexpected ways.
So what was your role in the testimony?
So we had contacted several folks asking them to testify on behalf of the bill. So I was one of the people who had attended in order to testify on behalf of it. So we had, gosh, I can't remember now. I know we contacted a representative of the police union. I can remember if she came. And did you remember?
Yeah, we had almost a half dozen people on each side testifying in support of the bill. And then typically the students would testify right after our the patron of the bill, who was our client. They would get up and present the bill when it was called, and then they might say, and we have a student from UVA here who's worked on this. And I think that's how it was when Scott testified, and it was the same when it went to the House, and his partner, Nate Wonderly, testified when the bill had gone over. And so it was Nate who was on the hot seat when the chairman of this committee we were in front of, started trying to poke holes in it. And it was, it wasn't anything Nate would necessarily have known. It took like being involved in the system for a long time to be able to respond and clarify when these questions came up. But yeah, it was about to go down.
It was this close.
And the chairman of this committee was kind of even. He was an equal opportunity second guesser of like many of the bills that had come before us. It didn't matter the party of the patron. So we were just, fortunate that there was a good answer to his question. And so that salvaged it.
I will say,
go
shout
ahead.
out to the clinic. I think the fact that we had, a small team between like me, Andy, Nate, and I dedicated to working on the bill, it made it possible to mount that kind of defense of it because we had a very detailed understanding of what had gone into the process of creating it. And I don't think that would always be possible for a legislator to do because they're working on so many things. And, if you want to poke holes in minutia, it can be difficult to defend it without that kind of detailed understanding from dedicating a lot of time to it.
What do you take away from an experience like that?
I guess a lot of the work of the legislative process is random and unpredictable. And I think you can prepare as best as you possibly can. And sometimes that preparation will come in handy like it did that day. But it's not always possible to prepare for every eventuality.
Sorry, I'm going to turn that off. I apologize. But then Scott also had the opportunity. He worked on another project that might be worth talking about for a second for the city of Charlottesville, where he was also in front of decision makers, since we're talking about.
Yeah. So is this also for the clinic?
Yep.
Yeah, this was also for the clinic.
Oh, yeah.
So this was my last project at the end of the year, the last like 2 or 3 months. Again, Maggie and I, we worked on creating additional property tax exemptions for the city of Charlottesville. So Virginia is a Dillon state. It's like one of the few remaining pure Dillon states, meaning that localities can't exercise any powers that aren't explicitly granted to them by the state government. In the state constitution, I don't remember the exact language now, but it says something to the effect of like the legislature can't, the legislature, whatever, the local body can't like alter the property tax rates. And like it's in the state constitution, it's pretty ironclad. But Charlottesville wanted to figure out if they could exempt more people from a property tax increase they were considering. So Maggie and I had to get pretty creative with potential solutions. And again, we met with a lot of experts in state and local government. Like we met with Professor Schrager, and he was super helpful. And we ended up coming up with a list of several like concrete proposals of things that they could implement right now. And in particular, there was one power under, I don't even remember what statute it was. It was, Andy, do you remember? It was the like the board that they could
like
create.
the human services section,
Yeah,
opposed to the tax section.
it was in a really weird spot, and it was like one of the last things we found. Like we thought we had explored everything, and then we found this huge potential tool they could use. Anyway, so we ended up presenting to the city council. We did it via Zoom, and it turned out to be kind of a hot topic for local residents who keep an eye on local city council happenings. And there was some buzz on Twitter. I had people tweeting at me like like asking me why the city wasn't implementing these things. I'm not going to respond to those. But yeah, it was exciting because it was something very tangible that the city could use, and I think they're planning on using. I don't know exactly, but they seemed interested in the proposals we gave, and certainly people at the local level were both happy to see that these solutions existed and frustrated that they hadn't been used before. But yeah, we were able to give them like actual tools to exempt folks from the proposed increases.
Wow, that's really neat. Oh,
And one other thing, just like kind of circling back to something we talked about before in terms of the writing of the report, you know, one of the values of writing the report for the commission was so that even if the recommendations weren't immediately enacted or pursued by the General Assembly, they would still be there and memorialized so that people in years to come could look at that as a resource and a place where there were good policy ideas to tackle these complicated issues. So it will hopefully have enduring value. And it's also like one of the benefits of this website that the law library is creating is so they can access these reports, because otherwise they are going to be hard to find. And Scott, I don't know if you know this, and I didn't know this also, but in the final budget, one of the proposals that we had included in the report was for Virginia to create expand its state-based earned income tax credit, and that actually made it through into the final budget, which is a really important tool for addressing poverty, you know, for people who make wages, but not enough to get refunds on their taxes. And so one of the commission members runs something called the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analytics. And she just shared recently that made it in the budget, and they had been working on it for years. And so, you know, Scott's work and the work of the commission helped get it in the budget and helped it stay in the budget. So congrats on that, Scott, too.
That's awesome. I didn't know that made it in. That's really exciting.
So I want to just sort of move towards wrapping up. And I was wondering, with all this work that you did as part of the clinic, I guess specifically for the commission, what had the biggest impact on you?
I do think it was writing the introduction for the report. I spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking about it with folks. It's hard to know like what the impact is because, you know, we didn't do any follow-ups or ask people how they reacted to it. But I think that was very helpful for me because I want to work in policy, and this is something I want to do the rest of my life, and thinking about how to effectively message to people who don't necessarily already agree with me without compromising on my principles without devaluing the things I think are important, but still finding a way to at least attempt to communicate with people who aren't already on the same page as I am.
Mhm. And just building off what you just said a little bit more, how has this work for the clinic shaped your professional training or your career trajectory?
I mean, it's been enormously helpful. Like Andy said, I mean, it was kind of joking, but it's true. Like having this as a line item on my resume and something to talk about in interviews has been extremely helpful. Like the report writing in particular, I think is a very tangible skill that a lot of people want to see, doing that kind of research and presenting and then putting it in a synthesized format. And then I also came away with several concrete writing samples, like the report, obviously, but then two, also the report that Maggie and I, the memo that we wrote for City Council about our proposals. I'm very proud of that work. I know, actually, I don't remember which professor it was, but apparently one of the LRW professors used that as an example of like effective legal writing, that one else could try to implement. So yeah, I was very proud of that work, and feel like I came away from the clinic both with skills I didn't have before, examples of that kind of work, and an expanded network of folks who work in the field that I'm interested in.
Great. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to cover?
I don't think so. Andy, is there anything that we didn't discuss that you think we should have? That's Andy's favorite question.
And everyone usually says is quiet when I ask that question. Another kind of tangible outcome, I guess, or recognition of some of the work that Scott did was, I believe that one of the passages from the introduction to the commission report that Scott helped write was cited, I think, in the Washington Post or the Times Dispatch. So there was a decent amount of media coverage when the report came out, and they lifted one of those passages, I'm pretty sure, and included it in the article. So, someone was paying, someone read it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott and Andy. This has been a really terrific interview. I thank you for your time, and I'm going to stop recording.